This is the final module of the first lecture, Darwin Deleted, where we look at a particular argument put forward by Peter Bowler, known as a counterfactual. As we'll see, a counterfactual is a particular way of exploring the what-ifs of history. What if something hadn't happened? What then would have happened? And intriguingly, Peter Bowler poses this question and asks us to imagine what would have happened had Darwin died before he had got an inkling of evolution through natural selection. Here we see Peter Bowler pictured, Professor of History of Science at Queen's University Belfast, and one of the principal scholars of Darwin and Darwinism. His textbook on evolution is excellent, and I'd recommend anyone who's taking this subject to read it. It will enrich your understanding of the material. Here's his counterfactual, and let's read it verbatim as spot of PowerPoint karaoke. Imagine a dark, stormy night in the South Atlantic at the end of December 1832. Aboard the Royal Navy survey vessel HMS Beagle, a young naturalist racked with seasickness staggers on deck. A sudden wave makes the ship heel violently and he's washed over the side. The lookout calls, "Man overboard!" But it's too dark to see anything in the churning sea, and the storm is too fierce for the officer on watch to risk turning the ship about. Charles Darwin is gone, and Captain Fitzroy will have to face the task of writing to the family in England to break the news. He will certainly tell them that in addition to their personal tragedy, the scientific community has lost a promising young naturalist who might have achieved great things. But he has no idea that Darwin's greatest achievement would have been to write one of the most controversial books of the century, a book that Fitzroy himself would have denounced in public, on the origin of species. What would a world without Darwin look like? The first thing we need to do when exploring this scenario is to place Bowler's argument in the context of counterfactual history overall, because it shares some similarities with a mode of exploring history that's become popular over the 1990s and into the 2000s. So the first thing we're going to do is put a few counterfactuals up to you to see what you think of them, what you make of them. So here are some what-ifs of history. Imagine if Napoleon, pictured here returning from exile on Elba, wins the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, rather than Nelson and the Allies of Britain. Imagine too, what would happen if Archduke Franz Ferdinand was not assassinated on the 28th of June 1914, precipitating the outbreak of the First World War. Imagine too, what would have happened if Edward Grey, the Foreign Secretary in the British Cabinet, had tried to persuade his colleagues and had succeeded that Britain should not go into the war in 1914. Or perhaps in 1940, Lord Halifax had remained in power as Prime Minister of Britain and had decided to pursue peace with Nazi Germany. What then would have occurred? Or perhaps during that ever so controversial election race in 2000 for the White House, the Chads had hung in Al Gore's favour and he had been declared victor. What would have happened in the USA? Think about the answers to all of those questions. What answer would you give? Would, for example, the USA, in the case of Gore, not have gone into Iraq? Not have fought the war in Afghanistan? Would it significantly have changed environmental policy? So pause for a moment and also think of examples of other counterfactuals in history. Can you think of other possible turning points, other sliding doors? And then, perhaps more practically and purposefully for this particular exercise, what purpose do you think the counterfactuals might serve? How might they help us understand history, if at all? And then let's take it down to the level of counterfactual scenarios from the history of science. Can you think of any possible ones? Any particular instances? Sliding door moments? Let's have a think about the purpose of counterfactuals, what they might be trying to achieve. E.H. Carr, who wrote one of the most celebrated books on the way that history is written, called What is History? If you haven't read it, you might want to do. He thought about counterfactuals and what they might achieve in the early 1960s. And what he said was that they were nothing better than a parlour game, or rather the sort of game that you might sit around after dinner playing. He felt that they served no practical historical purpose. However, the defenders of counterfactual history who started practicing it in the 1990s, individuals like Niall Ferguson, who's probably one of the most famous historians around the traps at the moment, the defenders of counterfactual history claim that what it does is it restores individualism and contingency, happenstance, to a history that had become dominated by determinism, by schools of history like Whig history, which is incredibly teleological, which imagines that history is always progressing to a predetermined point, or Marxism that sees class struggle with the economy underneath being the driving motor force of history. What counterfactual historians tend to believe is that it cuts against this and allows us to see those chance things that might occur, that might allow us to see the way that agency operates in history. Now, recently, Richard J. Evans has published a book called Altered Past, where he looks at the history of counterfactuals as well as counterfactuals in history. And what he's tended to discover is that counterfactuals tend to be a right-wing way of attacking things that the people writing them don't like. So, for example, Niall Ferguson, writing in his extremely long book, The Pity of War, puts forward the idea that if Britain hadn't entered the war, if it had been persuaded by someone like Grey that they shouldn't participate in the war, then the huge amount of economic and social damage done by the war wouldn't have occurred. They'd have stayed out of the conflict, and they would have stayed out of Europe, kept the empire intact, and all of those kind of things. Now, it just so happens that Ferguson himself is very against the notion of the integration of Europe and likes the idea of Britain staying out of it. And his alternative history, his counterfactual, seems to drive towards the position that he has on Europe in this present day. I don't think that Bowler's counterfactual is really very similar to the kind of work that people like Ferguson have been doing. And the reason it's not similar is because of the conclusions that he comes to. What he says is that if Darwin had been washed overboard before he had really got underway on the voyage of the Beagle, the biology would not have looked substantially different, although there might have been different weight given to natural selection. In HPS terms, this means that there really isn't very much contingency in biology, that there is always, natural selection is something out there in nature that was always going to be discovered, like the genes. He also concludes that the nasty stuff that we saw in the last module would still have happened. Without Darwin, there would have been the Nazis. Without Darwin, there would have been eugenics. Without Darwin, colonialism would have still been the force that it was. Now, it has to be said that, as you'll see if you read Darwin Deleted, the Bowler himself is writing the book in part as a response to creationists and intelligent designers who use things like the Nazis as a stick to beat Darwin around the head with. Now, the question I want to ask you, and the question that we'll keep coming back to at various points during this particular subject, is, do you think that these are valid conclusions? And that's the end of Module 5 and the end of the first online lecture